Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in sophomore English. I'm with you in your hymnals in Unit 3 on page 518, 519 and following. We have looked at expository nonfiction essay writing. We have looked at reflective writing, that is to say looking back to events or whatever. We now are going to look at humorous writing. Okay, so we're going to look at two texts. The first one will be a Twain offering called A Toast to the Oldest Inhabitant. And the second will be the great James Thurber's The Dog That Bit People. So we're going to look at both of these titles, and we're going to ask about them, what makes them humorous. Now, let's begin by asking an academic definition at page 518. What is a humorous essay? Our instincts are to say, well, humor is what's funny. Well, yeah, technically you're right. But we've got to flesh out just a little bit more of an understanding of what we're talking about. We're talking about humor. Take a look on page 518 real quickly. In a humorous essay or speech, a writer presents a subject in an unexpected, amusing way. The word unexpected, write that word down. That's huge. One of the things that makes humor is it's unexpected, right? The writer may treat a serious situation lightly or a ridiculous situation seriously. Techniques for creating humor include the following. We want to make sure we have these in our notes. 1, hyperbole. Let's get that one in our notes and make sure that when we hear this word hyperbole, we're talking about exaggeration. A writer describes people, things, events as if they were much more important than they are. For instance, calling the discovery of a missing sock a joyous reunion. Okay? 2, understatement. A writer speaks of people, things, events as if they were less important than they are. For instance, saying that, quote, the weather was not ideal after a tornado carries off picnic tables, for example. When a writer uses humor to point out the foolishness of a particular type of human behavior or a particular institution, the result is called satire. We want to write that down. Often, satire and humor will go together. We've talked, of course, before about satire. We'll continue. Mark Twain's speech, A Toast to the Oldest Inhabitant, and James Thurber's essay, The Dog That Bit People, use humor, but their comic techniques are different. We're going to use a chart to kind of help us here. By the way, pay attention on 518 to the word diction, word choice. Another literary element that contributes to humor. Authors try to select words that precisely convey the meaning they intend to do so. They consider a word's, this is huge, write it down in 2B, connotation. The denotation of a word is its dictionary definition. That's easy to remember because it starts with a D, right? Connotation, the set of ideas associated with it, as well as the word's denotation or definition. For example, the words house and home may mean place to live, but the word home is associated with ideas like family, comfort. The word house does not have these connotations. As you read these selections, consider the connotations of the author's diction, analyze how precise word choices contribute to both humorous meaning and one more word for us, tone, or the expression of the writer's attitude towards his or her subject and reader. So we've got a lot of work we're doing here as we now go forward with these two humorous offerings. So let's start with Mark Twain. Twain, of course, we read him in our freshman year, the story about the body that supposedly was being carried in the coffin back, and of course really what we were talking about was some stinky cheese. You'll maybe remember that Mark Twain text. Of course, in our freshman year we did the adventures of Tom Sawyer. In our junior year we do the adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Tom Sawyer, our Huck Finn, Mark Twain, let's remind ourselves just a little about the great writer. 1835 to 1910, right? The pen name of Samuel Langhorne Clemens, one of America's greatest writers. He's most famous for his two classic novels I just mentioned, Tom Sawyer, 1876, Huck Finn, 1884. Mark Twain became a sought-after, highly paid public speaker. He delivered a toast to the oldest inhabitants, that is to say what we're about to read, at the annual dinner of the New England Society on December 22nd, 1876. So write that down. He gave this as a speech to the annual dinner of the New England Society on December 22nd, 1876. All right? Now, in the Toast to the Oldest Inhabitant, the Weather of New England, that's the full title, right? In this speech, we're going to have Twain talking humorously about the weather. He's going to employ a lot of exaggeration, so write that down in 2B. We're going to be looking for exaggeration. Hyperbole, sometimes referred to. Personification, when we turn inanimate objects, give them human characteristics, right? And of course, satire. Twain, genius for his satire. Twain will intertwine imaginary anecdotes with the vagaries of New England's climate to support his thesis that nowhere in the world is there daily weather is very bizarre or magnificent as New England. Now, of course, we out here in the West know all about crazy weather as well. When we did our reading, for example, of Everest, there we talked about weather. Wherever people live, they seem to want to talk about the weather, especially older people like talking about the weather. If you notice this to be the case. So as we get in now to our reading here, we're going to hear Twain joking, exaggerating about the weather, the oldest inhabitant of New England. All right, let's go to work with it now. Pay attention, follow along, and let's kind of try and get a sense of maybe what kind of joking humor is going on here. All right, here we go.
A Toast to the Oldest Inhabitant, The Weather of New England, by Mark Twain. Who can lose it and forget it? Who can have it and regret it? Be interposer twixt us twain. Merchant of Venice. Gentlemen, I reverently believe that the Maker who made us all makes everything in New England but the weather. I don't know who makes that, but I think it must be raw apprentices in the weather clerk's factory who experiment and learn how in New England for board and clothes, and then are promoted to make weather for countries that require a good article and will take their custom elsewhere if they don't get it. There is a sumptuous variety about the New England weather that compels the stranger's admiration and regret. The weather is always doing something there, always attending strictly to business, always getting up new designs and trying them on the people to see how they will go. But it gets through more business in spring than in any other season. In the spring, I have counted 136 different kinds of weather inside of 24 hours. It was I that made the fame and fortune of that man that had that marvelous collection of weather on exhibition at the Centennial that so astounded the foreigners. He was going to travel all over the world and get specimens from all the climes. I said, "Don't you do it. You come to New England on a favorable spring day." I told him what we could do in the way of style, variety, and quantity. Well, he came, and he made his collection in 4 days. As to variety, why, he confessed that he got hundreds of kinds of weather that he had never heard of before. And as to quantity, well, after he had picked out and discarded all that was blemished in any way, he not only had weather enough, but weather to spare, weather to hire out, weather to sell, to deposit, weather to invest, weather to give to the poor.
522.
The people of New England are by nature patient and forbearing, but there are some things which they will not stand. Every year they kill a lot of poets for writing about beautiful spring.
Right?
These are generally casual visitors who bring their notions of spring from somewhere else and cannot, of course, know how the natives feel about spring. And so, the first thing they know, the opportunity to inquire how they feel has permanently gone by. Old Probabilities has a mighty reputation for accurate prophecy, and thoroughly well deserves it. You take up the papers and observe how crisply and confidently he checks off what today's weather is going to be on the Pacific, down south, in the Middle States, in the Wisconsin region. See him sail along in the joy and pride of his power till he gets to New England, and then see his tail drop. He doesn't know what the weather is going to be like in New England. He can't any more tell than he can tell how many presidents of the United States there's going to be next year. Well, he mulls over it, and by he gets out something about like this. Probable northeast to southwest winds, varying to the southward and westward and eastward and points between, high and low barometer, swapping around from place to place, probable areas of rain, snow, hail, and
523.
Succeeded or preceded by earthquakes with thunder and lightning. Then he jots down this postscript from his wandering mind to cover accidents. But it is possible that the program may be wholly changed in the meantime.
In other words, you'll never figure out the weather.
Yes, one of the brightest gems in the New England weather is the dazzling uncertainty of it. There is only one thing certain about it. You are certain there is going to be plenty of weather. A perfect grand review, but you never can tell which end of the procession is going to move first. You fix up for the drought, You leave your umbrella in the house and sally out with your sprinkling pot, and 10 to 1, you get drowned. You make up your mind that the earthquake is due. You stand from under and take hold of something to steady yourself, and the first thing you know, you get struck by lightning. These are great disappointments, but they can't be helped. The lightning there is peculiar. It is so convincing. When it strikes a thing, it doesn't leave enough of that thing behind for you to tell whether, well, you'd think it was something valuable, and a congressman had been there. And the thunder. When the thunder commences to merely tune up and scrape and saw and key up the instruments for the performance, strangers say, "Why, what awful thunder you have here." But when the baton is raised and the real concert begins, you'll find that stranger down in the cellar with his head in the ash barrel. Now, as to the size of the weather in New England, lengthways I mean, it is utterly disproportioned to the size of that little country. Half the time, when it is packed as full as it can stick, you will see that New England weather sticking out beyond the edges and projecting around hundreds and hundreds of miles over the neighboring states. She can't hold a tenth part of her weather. You can see cracks all about where she has strained herself trying to do it. I could speak volumes about the inhuman perversity of the New England weather, but I will give but a single specimen. I like to hear rain on a tin roof, so I covered part of my roof with tin with an eye to that luxury. Well, sir, do you think it ever rains on the tin? No, sir, skips it every time. Mind, in this speech, I've been trying merely to do honor to the New England weather. No language could do it justice. But, after all, there are at least one or two things about that weather, or, if you please, effects produced by it, which we residents would not like to part with. If we hadn't our bewitching autumn foliage, we should still have to credit the weather with one feature which compensates for all its bullying vagaries: the ice storm.
524.
When a leafless tree is clothed with ice from the bottom to the top, ice that is as bright and clear as crystal. When every bough and twig is strung with ice beads, frozen dewdrops, and the whole tree sparkles cold and white, like the Shah of Persia's diamond plume. Then the wind waves the branches, and the sun comes out and turns all those myriads of beads and drops to prisms that glow and burn and flash with all manner of colored fires, which change and change again with inconceivable rapidity from blue to red, from red to green, and green to gold. The tree becomes a spraying fountain, a very explosion of dazzling jewels. And it stands there, the acme, the climax, the supremest possibility in art or nature of bewildering, intoxicating, intolerable magnificence. One cannot make the words too strong. Month after month, I lay up my hate and grudge against the New England weather. But when the ice storm comes at last, I say, "There, I forgive you now. The books are square between us. You don't owe me a cent. Go and sin no more. Your little faults and foibles count for nothing. You are the most enchanting weather in the world."
Now, this is a very interesting little essay. First of all, let's go ahead and jump to 2B. It is, of course, humorous, as we have said, because of the use of exaggeration, hyperbole, joking, some satire. But we're going to ask at the end of this essay how Twain kind of finishes this little speech by something other than satire. So he's doing something, rhetorically speaking, pretty remarkable. Let's make sure, though, at level 1, what you have written down. Let's just go through the essay quickly to make sure we address what happens in this essay at level 1. Number 1, notice he begins, first of all, by saying to the ones that he's speaking to, I want to talk about the oldest inhabitant of New England, the weather, right? That is to say, everybody who lives in New England knows all about the weather. By the way, you notice on page 522 that when we talk about New England, we're talking about this area of the United States. And if you look at that little map on 522, you can see all along to the eastern coast, that is to say to the right, all of that is the Atlantic Ocean. And because of that, about that water and the ocean there, you have serious kinds of weather patterns that happen out there that are so different from almost any other place in the United States. Okay, so it is true, the weather in New England has a lot to do with the relationship between that body of water and, of course, all other kinds of issues as well of geography. But that's where he begins. Notice he begins by talking about the spring. He talks on page 521 about all of the different kinds of weather. He even will exaggerate with a number of 136. We're not expected to take him seriously here. This is an exaggeration. In other words, the weather is constantly changing all the time. He even tells a joke about somebody who showed up to study the weather and take samples of the weather, and in 4 days was able to get all kinds of different samples. Again, exaggeration. Then he talks a little bit on page 522 about the way the weather constantly is changing. By 523, the uncertainty of the weather. The only thing certain is the uncertainty of the weather. He then talks about the lightning. He talks about the thunder. He talks about a visitor coming to visit New England. It's like, oh, you guys have some serious thunder here. Just notice his word picture, as if God were the conductor of a symphony and he's only just getting the instruments ready. He says it when the thunder actually starts. The one who's so interested in the thunder is down in the basement with the head down in the cellar with his head in the ash barrel. In other words, trying to save himself. The size of the weather is as well. Notice the personification on 523. She can't hold a 10th part of her weather. She can see cracks all around her where she has strained herself trying to do it. In other words, it always breaks apart. But by the end of this speech, this little brief speech, Twain seems to want to take a shift and to begin to celebrate the weather. More particularly with the autumn foliage coming in on page 524. He wants to begin to talk about ice storms. The expectation, again, notice, humor is doing what's not expected. The expectation is that he's going to talk about ice storms. He's talking about how terrible they are. But notice he finishes the essay by celebrating ice storms because of the way they make the trees look. Namely, when the ice sticks to the tree branches, how amazingly beautiful it is with all of the different colorations. And to that degree, he finishes by saying he's ready to forgive the gods, the weather gods, right? Because of the beauty of the ice storms, more particularly about what's left, right? After the ice storm comes and then leaves. And of course, all the melting and how beautiful it all is. All right, that's level 1. Let's jump to level 2 at 2A. What is a simple message here for you? And again, this doesn't have to be real complicated, right? Some students will write down the uncertainty of weather. Some students will write down the power of nature, the uncertainty of nature, the ways that humans can't control it at all, right? It's fascinating if you could go back and show Twain what today we now know about weather and the ways that, for example, meteorologists can predict weather patterns days and even sometimes weeks and even sometimes months in advance. Back in Twain's day, none of that could happen, which of course made the whole predicting of weather kind of a joke. Today, of course, you can look at weather patterns and weather predictions are way more like legit than back when Twain was writing this one. Some will see this as just simply the celebration of nature, and you can write this one down that way as well. At 3A, Rachel Carson's tribute celebration of the shoreline comes to mind that we looked at before. At 2B, well, what makes this humorous? Because I have students that will say, I've read this is not funny to me. No. We didn't say it was funny. We said it was humor. Well, yeah, but isn't humor supposed to be funny? Not necessarily. Go back and look at what you wrote down at 2B. Exaggeration. Can you find an example? Saying that he found 130-something different weathers. Obviously exaggeration. Correct? Satire. Saying that he loves something when in fact you can tell that he's actually saying that he really hates it. Or surprise. The unexpected. Assuming he's going to complain about ice storms and he finishes by talking about how amazing they are because of the way it makes everything beautiful. Let's jump to 3A. What is for you your favorite text about weather? It may be a movie. It may be a TV show where, for example, there's something about weather and the power of weather. We might think about it that way. Do you have a text that comes to mind that celebrates that? Finally, at 3B, what is your relationship to weather? Now that you are starting to get older, I know ball players will often say this. When I was a kid in elementary school, I didn't even think about weather when I got up in the morning. Now that I'm a ball player, I pay very close attention. Football players will often say, soccer players will often say, I wake up in the morning and the very first thing I do is look outside in season because I want to know what the weather looks like. To what degree do you have a preference for weather and seasons? Is there a time of the year you prefer more than other times of the year? Is there a time of the year you hate? Finally, at 3B, what's a moment in your life when you really did have a disgust towards nature? Oh, maybe the worst imaginable experience with the weather. And then what's a time in your life when the weather was perfect? Can you remember the perfect weather day? When you actually maybe said out loud, I wish every day was like this day. And what you were talking about was the weather. Well, there you go. One more text by Twain who will maybe make us smile. Thank you.